With me live in the studio is Geoff Chambers, one of the authors of the book that lifted the lid on Scott Morrison's secret ministerial portfolios. Geoff, thanks for your time. Time plagued has really exploded this week in a political sense. This issue about the ministerial portfolios, did the person, the source that told you about that, did they think it was going to be a positive or a controversial thing that they'd told you?
Well, the purpose of the book was to, over a 2-year period, we've detailed forensically, blow by blow, what went on behind the scenes. And this was obviously, early on in the pandemic, March 2020. It was really unprecedented times for Australians. So, in a way, after they invoked the Biosecurity Act, the far-reaching powers that delivers, and they were pumping billions of dollars out the door, there was probably some justification for Scott Morrison to have done what he did. And his explanation of it was in relation to if either Matthias Cormann or Greg Hunt went down with the virus, that he would be there ready to go. I think the issue that we've seen in the last week or so, the last few days, is in relation to the secrecy of it. Now, Greg Hunt, we know, knew about it.
Well, we didn't know about it till this was in the Australian at the weekend.
No, and this is the point that I'm trying to get to here, is that he should have probably told his colleagues. He should have probably told the Australian people. There was a press conference, I think it was around March 18, where he came close to revealing that he had been sworn in as Joint Health Minister. And this is just after the Governor-General ticked off on the biosecurity measures. But even in that press conference, he didn't go as far as saying that I am being sworn in as Joint Minister, and these are the reasons why. So I think, what we've seen in the last few days, obviously, is in hindsight and on reflection, that particularly your Finance Minister, who left in October of that year, and I understand the department was alerted, but Matthias Cormann clearly wasn't, and Scott Morrison was very apologetic for that today.
Did Morrison or any other source mention other portfolios to you at the time?
Subsequent to the publication of the book, I'd heard that in relation to this PEP 11 offshore gas permit off Newcastle, that Scott Morrison had moved into that resources space to make that decision. And he was under a lot of pressure, if you recall, from a lot of the moderate Liberals in those northern Sydney seats, and a lot of their candidates in the Hunter and Lucy Wicks in the Central Coast. So I'd heard that. I then subsequently found out that extended not only to resources, but across the entirety of the department, so energy, industry and science. And my understanding is that those ministers weren't aware of Mr Morrison taking on those responsibilities.
And on that point that you made earlier, the secrecy erupting here and being the problem, reading through this book and being someone who covered the Prime Minister Morrison term in office, his 4 years or so, secrecy seemed to be something that stumped him and his office a lot of times. They weren't always as upfront as they should have been. Is that a fair characterisation?
Yeah, I think it was also incredibly extraordinary times. The first pandemic in 100 years in this country. So things were being done that were very unorthodox. A lot of things were being done on the run, and very big funding packages and health reforms. A lot of reforms took place during that time that a lot of Australians don't realise. So, look, you could argue that at times, that communication broke down, and I think, heading towards the May 21 election and off the back of 3 terms of coalition rule, there was some, tiredness across the ranks.
Do you think, going back to that initial question, that the person and source or sources that told you about the secret portfolios saw that as Morrison taking charge, as saying, look, I've got to step up here? Yeah, and it was a positive more than a negative.
I think it was a reflection of those extraordinary, unprecedented times, and that this is how far the Prime Minister had to go to make sure that he could protect the country, and that's I think that's, at the time, Peter Dutton.
It's blown up since.
It has, and
incredibly.
And there is an argument, obviously under the Constitution, what was done was legal, and the Governor General takes advice from the Prime Minister. But you usually see that used when a minister is off crook, or a minister is away for another reason, and another minister will take on those responsibilities, or a Prime Minister. But generally, that is the public, and particularly colleagues, are alerted to the fact.
Yeah, and so if we go to a few of the other things, before we get to those issues, I should put to you as well what Anthony Albanese said today in that news conference. He said that he said this is early days, the report on the weekend for the book, and there's a range of questions about who knew what and when, and the authors of the book who put out the first revelations can answer for themselves on that. What would you say to Mr Albanese on that, as to when you and your colleague Simon Benson became aware of these secret portfolios?
Well, yeah, we spoke to dozens of people over 2 years, and this was part of the story. And, well, the story's out now. So, yeah, that's my response.
Okay. Now, some of the other issues in here I should ask you about. I found fascinating this exchange made public, the messaging between the Prime Minister and the Victorian Premier, Daniel Andrews, about trying to calm things down when it looked like it was going to erupt between the federal and state government. This goes to how delicate things were at that time, when privately they might have been ripping each other apart metaphorically, and I know Josh Frydenberg was publicly very critical, but privately Scott Morrison and Daniel Andrews tried to keep things on the even keel.
It got very willing, didn't it, between the feds and the states, and over a long period of time. So the National Cabinet, which we write about in terms of its formation, which was done on the run, I think, in March 2020, and that was intended to bring them all closer and have better communication. But ultimately, it also exposed responsibilities, and it was a constant thread throughout the pandemic of one side blaming the other and briefing against the other. So politics always wins, Kieran, as you know, and at the end of the day, they're people, I guess, and some publicly, outwardly would have hostile things to say about the other, and then privately there was obviously different relationships.
And that part about China, where the critics of Scott Morrison would ask, why did Australia have to be the first to act in terms of the response to the pandemic and calling for the inquiry and so on? And you and Simon Wright, to that, Morrison would simply ask who that someone else would be. So he wears it as a badge of honour, doesn't he, in terms of that China response? Yeah,
I think you have to recall that, pre-pandemic, the relationship was already pretty dire in a lot of respects. And, they'd banned a lot of our exports. The rhetoric was fiery. Lots of threats were being flown around, and a lot of that was one way from them to us. And I think, they obviously had a lot of security advice in relation to, mass cyber attacks and other strategic elements of what China was doing to us. So that was in their thinking that they needed to get on the front foot.
Congrats on the book, Plagued. Geoff Chambers, you with Simon Benson, you have not struggled for a bit of publicity, that's for sure.
Thanks, Kieran.
Congrats on the read, appreciate it.